another historical fiction author chat. I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage with me today, Tara Moss. She's fantastic. I don't know if you've read her stuff. I've just started. It's fantastic. It's historical fiction with mystery, and you just have to read it. And the book that we are talking about today, let's see if I can get my iPad to show up here. The Ghosts of Paris. Oh, there it is. You'll love it. Anyway, I sit back. Oh, by the way, thank you for being here, Tara.
Thank you so much for having me. So it's like such a pleasure and an honor to chat with you as well. So double bonus for me.
I'm very excited to introduce you to all these readers, and you have to go out and get this one. It's already out. It's been out since June. It's on the bestsellers list if you have been watching those lists, which I always do. And go get your copy. But anyway, I will get you interested in it. And then when she reads to you, you'll be sunk. You'll have to get your own copy. So, all right, I will read Tara's bio first. Tara Moss is an internationally best-selling author, human rights activist, documentary and podcast host, and model. Her crime novels have been published in 19 countries and 13 languages, and her memoir, The Fictional Woman, was a #1 international bestseller. Her most recent novel, The Ghosts of Paris, is second in the Billie Walker mystery series. A UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, she has received the Edna Ryan Award for significant contributions to feminist debate and for speaking out on behalf of women and children. In 2017, Tara Moss was recognized as one of the global top 50 diversity figures in public life. In 2021, she hosted the Audible original true crime podcast, The Man in the Balaclava. Tara Moss lives in British Columbia with her family. Holy smokes, Tara. That's like so much. Wow.
It's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm one of those strange people, Genevieve. I've like lived several lifetimes in this single life. So I feel very privileged to have done so many varied things.
Well,
Keeps it interesting.
yeah, well, I feel very lucky to finally be meeting you and to learn just a little bit of that iceberg and chat with you about it. All right, The Ghosts of Paris. It's 1947. The world continues to grapple with the fallout of the Second World War, and former war reporter Billie Walker is finding her feet as an investigator. When a wealthy client hires Billie and her assistant Sam to track down her missing husband, the trail leads back to London and Paris, where Billie's own painful memories also lurk. Jake Rake, Billie's wartime lover and briefly husband, is just one of the millions of people who went missing in Europe during the war. What was his fate after they left Paris together? As Billie's search for her client's husband takes her to the swanky bars of Paris's Ritz Hotel and the dank basements of the infamous morgue, she'll need to keep her gun at the ready. Something even more terrible than a few painful memories might be following her around the city of light. So great. All right, so I am going to turn it over to you, Tara.
Okay.
Treat, and I'll be back after.
Thank you, Genevieve. So I have the pleasure of reading chapter 1 for you today. Though I wonder if I should read the prologue too, because Genevieve has very kindly given me like 15 minutes to read, which is a lot. I think I'll read the prologue and chapter 1, if that's okay with you. I don't think I'll go over time. Okay, The Ghosts of Paris. Prologue. Wola, Poland, 1944. He pressed back against brick and stone, arms over his head, shielding himself, as the buildings shook and the earth beneath him rumbled. When the blast subsided and he opened his eyes, the square was shrouded in white dust and ash, a sight both curiously beautiful and chilling, as tiny fragments of the town and the people in it spread like unearthly snow all around. This was not destruction from a single grenade, that comparatively tiny, violent salvo of resistance, nor was this from the Nazis' devastating Goliath-tracked mines. For days, the west of the city had been raided and torched, residents shot on the spot or tortured for information, and so he knew this ash was not only the remains of building and concrete, but also the remains of those who had perished within the village square during the days of tireless massacre. The Nazi burning detachment was destroying evidence of the massacre here, and so his photographs, if he could smuggle them out, would matter all the more. He tried not to breathe in the deadly smoke, tried not to let it inside him. Over the past 2 days, he had not eaten, had barely found a sip of water, and he was somehow almost glad, as the stench of the air would surely have made him retch if he breathed it in. There had been shouting and movement, a grenade explosion, and now the noises stopped, a kind of respite to match the eerie, slowly falling ash. He wiped his face and raised his camera. Crouching, he moved forward on one knee. It was not safe. None of this was safe. Just a few more shots, and he would retreat to the makeshift shelter inside the bombed-out building behind him, the building that for now obscured his presence and that of his ever-present camera. But he would have to find a safer place before the dogs were let loose to seek out survivors to be killed. Already half of his focus was on escaping with his photographs. He had been in tight situations before, smuggling film out and empty toothpaste tubes, but this, he feared, was yet more serious. How would he do it? The conflict had quickly revealed itself to be a homegrown uprising of Polish rebels against a well-planned, well-resourced Nazi mission of outright extermination. The German soldiers were killing all citizens, all witnesses. If they found him, they would not let him live. That he knew. Makeshift barricades constructed of torn up and shattered flagstones had been manned by several young Polish boys with rifles and homemade grenades and bombs, one of which, no doubt, had caused the latest blast. But as the dust cleared, he noticed the brave boys were nowhere to be seen. Their modest supply against the Nazis' black hunters and SS police battalions doubtless spent. He seemed alone in the bloody square, though he doubted that was the case. Had the resistance, such as they were after 5 years of occupation and days of nonstop fighting, retreated to where they had a better stronghold, the square now ceded? The dust in the air moments before had been alive with bullets, boots, and ash, and now settled, it seemed, to make way for something greater, something slow and menacing. He heard the heavy crunch of tracks moving over the ground and knew instantly what it was. There was shouting in German, but he could not make out the words. From somewhere came a woman's screams, disturbingly urgent and clear in the temporary quiet. A new rumbling grew louder. Something was coming. A German tank moved into the square, gun first. It was a mighty Tiger II, weighing nearly 70 tons, moving right into the line of sight of his Argus camera. The massive machine with its brutal gun turret thundered steadily into the square towards the makeshift barricades, lumbering inelegantly over each bump like a great impenetrable beast, crushing everything in its path. No barricade would be equal to it. He pushed his back into the dusty building again, and his shutter clicked again. He brought the camera down from his face. No, he was not mistaken. There was something hanging on the front of the tank. Something tied there. Not something, someone. A woman. It was her screams he had heard. A woman in civilian dress, tethered by the wrist to this huge gun, her body dwarfed by its size and stretched out, legs pulled back and secured by the ankles to either side of the front of the tank. Her dress was dirty and torn, her white face twisted in horror and framed by lank brown hair. Petite and terrified, she might have been 14 or 40, a mother or a child. All he saw was primal terror in her large dark eyes. Again, her screams filled the square, far above the din of the tank's infernal rumbling. The sound proved too much. Before he'd even begun to comprehend his actions, begun to form a plan, he foolishly rushed forward, hands outstretched, his Argus swinging awkwardly at his sides, momentarily forgotten. He crossed the square in seconds and leapt onto the front of the massive, slow-moving monolith, which would not pause for him, not for anyone save its master at the helm. Caught in a kind of temporary madness, he tore at the ropes that bound the struggling woman with a singular focus. Once he had freed her left ankle, she twisted in place and gestured to her other ankle. "Tamten," she shouted in Polish, "that one." He had to get the other one next, or she could fall face first before the tank and be crushed. He tore at the binds and heard the great hull opening, a soldier shouting. There was no time. The soldier was climbing out and reaching for his pistol. From the corner of his eye, he caught the movement as the woman, she was indeed an adult woman, perhaps in her 20s, he realized, swung herself nimbly upwards onto the mammoth gun with a grunt of effort and locked her dirt-streaked legs around it. She was hanging upside down beneath the gun, and despite his own dangerous position, he watched as if mesmerized as she inched herself forward with surprising speed and a survivor's will, as nimble as any acrobatic performer, until her secured wrists slipped off the end of the giant gun and she fell backwards, swimming into the air, dress and hair hanging, suspended by her legs, the ropes now loose and no longer binding her. With a mechanical grinding, the gun turret moved to the left, taking her with it, and she let go, throwing herself from the giant tank, then disappearing from view. There was a pistol shot, then another, and reality came back to him with a crash as he realized just how exposed he was, the precariousness of his position on the enemy tank. He turned to jump, but was not fast enough. The Nazi soldier was faster, and as he hurled himself off the tank's side, it was caught across his neck, his body jerking back and upwards, something killing all breath, a sick gurgling sound in his ears. He hung like a rag doll from the side of the tank by his own leather camera strap, and the mighty Tiger II continued through the square, gun roving, the beast not halting, not even slowing. Desperately, he clutched the strap at his neck, frantic for air, and saw blood on his fingers, his hands. It was his own, he realized. The strap of his camera was cutting in, his neck opening up. There was shouting in German, another pistol shot, and the world went blank. A breath after that prologue. And now we go into chapter 1. Sydney, Australia, 1947. On May Day, the client walked into the offices of B. Walker Private Inquiries, announced by a faint buzzer. Billie Walker heard this from her position at her small 6th-floor balcony, where she'd been smoking a lucky strike and regarding with a well-honed emotional detachment the safety bridge that connected Daking House to Station House. She heard the door, heard the little buzzer, heard her secretary come assistant welcome the stranger, the voices muffled by the closing of the connecting door, and took a long drag. On the slow exhale, smoke floated from Billie's red lips, creating a temporary haze across her view of the city streets. Cigarette dangling, Billie turned, closed the balcony doors behind her, and walked to the oval mirror on the wall inside her office. She checked her emerald tilt hat and red lipstick in one quick and practiced movement, regarded the steady blue-green eyes staring back at her in the reflection, and satisfied, made for the corner of her wide wooden desk and stubbed out the last of her fag. Smoke drifted upwards, settling in the air. The bakelite clock above her door informed her that this potential client was right on time. This one had made an appointment. Though Billie had not been furnished with any information regarding the nature of her query, complaint, or troubles, only a surname. Things having improved at Billie's humble agency in recent months, Ms. Walker, the B of B. Walker Private Inquiries, and the principal agent, no longer had to wait out long days for the phone to ring or a knock at the door, and for the moment, at least, did not need to contemplate the empty walnut chairs in the small waiting room and find odd jobs for her secretary to do. Business was booming for Sydney's most famous, or was it infamous, female inquiry agent. Billie smoothed down her skirt suit, opened the connecting door, and leaned against the open door frame to take in the stranger who had entered her waiting room. She did so hope this wasn't another divorce job. Ah, here she is now. May I present Miss Billie Walker, Samuel Baker, her tall secretary announced, right on cue. Ms. Walker, this is Mrs. Richard Montgomery. She still had no first name of her own, Billie thought. Shame. Amusingly, the woman's gaze was fixed on Billy's secretary in his lightly striped suit and flattering tie of burgundy and sky blue that brought out his baby blues. A flirtatious smile played on the older woman's painted lips as she regarded him. To be true, Sam was a pleasing sight. He was a strapping Australian lad whose experience in the war had left him changed, most notably his injured left hand, which was always covered by a leather glove, lending him a touch of mystery. That hand had come up against an Italian thermos bomb and was now missing a few fingers, replaced by wooden prosthetics. Sam had already proved himself invaluable on numerous occasions, so if Billy had his injury to thank for the fact that he was happy to work for her, well, the Army's loss was her gain. He didn't mind taking orders from a woman, far too rare a trait in her opinion, and his trigger hand was as whole and steady as you could ask for. It was a bonus that he was something like Alan Ladd in appearance, though far taller, built several axe handles across, as the saying went. As Sam provided a handsome distraction, Billy took in the woman's appearance quickly and efficiently, observing cues drilled into her from work as a private inquiry agent, and before that, as a war reporter, and a childhood spent listening to her father, Billie Walker, the policeman turned private investigator who had inhabited these very offices, sitting at that wide wooden desk and smoking on that same small balcony where his only child now spent her moments of contemplation. Always look at the shoes, he would say, the fit and quality of the suit, the timepiece, the hat. Look at the eyes. Each detail tells a story. Indeed, it did. At a trained glance, this woman's story appeared to be one of style and apparent luxury, not something one saw in great abundance since the war. The suede burgundy shoes were new and well crafted, the stockings nylon and without flaw. Billy suspected this woman had never had to stoop to painting her legs with gravy and drawing a line up the back of her legs with eye pencil to create the illusion of stockings, as so many had. The Akoya pearl set she wore was delicate and quite real, Billy was sure, that particular desirable luster not being possible in the new fakes. Her navy skirt suit was notable for being of the latest style, echoing the scandalously feminine silhouette of Christian Dior's new look that had taken the fashion world by storm months before. Softly rounded shoulders, nipped waist, a slightly fuller skirt falling mid-calf, not quite full enough to cause outrage on the streets of Sydney, rationing still being in place, but enough to set this woman apart as a specimen of fashion, a local doyenne of the Parisian trend. Yes, it set her apart, as did the genuine high-quality glass-eyed fox stole she wore around her shoulders. This was no pre-war throwback. Mrs. Montgomery somehow had her finger on the pulse of international fashion trends and had money and the tailors to pull it off for her. Billy rather wanted to get a name. One thing was for certain, this was a woman of means, and that impression was confirmed by the crowning glory of her engagement ring, which was over a carat, Billy's trained eyes told her, and completely overshadowed the comparatively simple wedding ring worn with it. Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Montgomery, Billy said, and meant it, satisfied that she was attracting the sort of clientele whose checks were unlikely to bounce like rubber. She lifted her shoulder off the doorframe and smiled, locking eyes with the Joan Crawford-esque beauty. Mrs. Montgomery had large eyes in a strong, rectangular face, her gaze direct and framed by dyed red hair worn short across the forehead and swept back to a center part beneath a flat, tilted navy hat. It was the face of a strong-willed woman of high standards. "Won't you come into my office?" Billy said, and turned on her stacked Oxford heel. She disappeared inside, and the woman followed in the investigator's wake, her posture erect and proud, eyes flicking back to Sam, who was trailing just behind. If he was bothered by the woman's flirtatious gaze, he didn't let on. The office Billie Walker welcomed this fashionable stranger into was not the kind of surrounds where Mrs. Montgomery would seem, under normal circumstances, to belong. Though Billie was not exactly unglamorous herself, with the striking contrast of her dark hair and pale skin and her tussie's fighting red lipstick. The utilitarian office suited her like a battered trench coat or a well-traveled uniform. It was a place of action, with Billie herself a devotee of action, as the war years and more recent events as an inquiry agent attested. Fashion was something she enjoyed and employed in her profession to gain entry to all echelons of society, but her office had very few frills about it. Her aristocratic mother, if she ever again deigned to lower herself enough to grace those four walls, would complain that the place lacked a woman's touch. Despite the space now being occupied by Billie and her so far exclusively female clientele. Billie had left it much the same as when her late father had operated his agency. The carpets were rust red, the filing cabinets a fading hunter green, the wooden desk appropriately scarred, all of it imbued with a sense of his presence, now further layered by this new generation of Walker investigator. The only concessions to its new occupant were the placement of a handy mirror, a small bottle of Bandit perfume on a shelf, some personal photographs, and the addition of a few more of the fashionable women's journals in the waiting room. The place suited Billie well, as if her late father had lovingly worn it in for her. Sam plugged the doorway to the office, waiting, knowing the next part of this client ritual well. "Would you care for tea, Mrs. Montgomery?" Billie asked, once the woman was comfortably seated across the desk in the chair she reserved for clients. "Thank you kindly," she replied, and broad-shouldered Sam disappeared, gently closing the door behind him with a barely audible click. Billie had seen him throw a fully grown man across an alley with his good hand, but he played down his physical size and strength in situations such as this, his strategic invisibility well practiced. Mrs. Montgomery, who had taken time to watch Sam go, was now surveying the space around her. Although such roughly finished spaces did not seem her natural habitat, she showed no signs of disappointment. Perhaps if she'd been living as a bird in the proverbial gilded cage, as was one theory Billie was forming, more salubrious surrounds would not be comforting in this moment. Something had brought her out of her natural habitat and into Billie's. "Are you the only woman investigator in Sydney?" Mrs. Montgomery asked. "Sometimes," Billie said, and leaned one elbow on the wooden desk. One of her competitors was currently in jail for some petty matter, nothing to do with Billie, of course. Her main competition came from male investigators, however. They dominated the trade, and always had. In fact, much of her posts still arrived for a Mr. B. Walker, as if the fact of her obvious femininity was not quite enough to overcome the assumption that the principal of a private inquiry agency would be a grizzled gentleman gumshoe. "How may I be of assistance today?" Billie asked. "You assisted a friend of mine, Nettie Brown, you may recall," the woman began. Billie did recall. That had been late 1946, almost 6 eventful months later, and had begun as a seemingly routine missing persons case, a search for Nettie's 17-year-old son, and evolved into something far larger and more sinister. She resisted looking again towards her smoking balcony, even while a vivid image of the Nazi who had flung himself over it flashed through her memory. Yes, she did indeed recall the case. A fair bit of Sydney did also. "Nettie was quite impressed with you. She recommended you rather highly," the woman went on. "That is pleasing to hear." Billie's gaze moved to the glass-eyed fox around Mrs. Montgomery's shoulders, as if it could tell her that it had been purchased at the Browns' family fur shop in the Strand Arcade. Her muscles had tensed at the memory of the case. There had been a good outcome, but not without shots fired and lives altered and lost. But then she and Trouble knew each other rather intimately. No reason the end of the war should stop such a seemingly natural pairing, she supposed. "I understand you spoke with her a few months ago," Mrs. Montgomery continued. "Yes," Billie replied. She had, in fact, run into Mrs. Nettie Brown, in the literal sense, under quite the most extraordinary circumstances on New Year's Day. It had been a frightfully humid day, and just as Billie was having her semi-regular afternoon tea with her informant Shyla at the Central Railway refreshment room, a freak hailstorm had hit, assaulting Sydney from the skies with considerable violence. The clock face above the station was smashed, and the skylight along the entire main assembly platform had been decimated, raining shards of glass on those below. To Billie, it had sounded like a squadron of bombers, and those who had been there could be forgiven for thinking it was a return of the Blitz. Fortunately, most of the waiting commuters had only recently been whisked away on their various journeys. In the midst of this maelstrom, Billie had sprinted from the refreshment room to determine the cause of the thunderous crashing, always the type to run towards chaos and not away from it. And Nettie Brown had run straight into her head on. After a moment of shocked recognition, the women had sheltered together by the central concourse until the storm passed. Their somewhat bruising meeting had felt particularly and peculiarly like foreshadowing at the time. The case for the Brown family was officially closed, but loose ends niggled at Billie, never quite letting go despite the passing months. And it seemed the powers that be weren't keen on releasing her either. She only hoped those loose ends weren't weaving themselves into a noose for her or for someone else. Shall I keep going, Genevieve?
Well, maybe we shouldn't give it all
I
away.
don't want to give it all away.
Let me just.
After that image of the loose ends weaving themselves into a noose.
Yes, I think everyone should get out there and buy their own copy because Kara's gonna work herself dry doing all that reading.
Oh my gosh.
That was so beautiful. And have you, in all of your lives that you have lived, have you acted as well?
I haven't acted, no. I'm a terrible actor, actually. I can speak in front of any size of crowd on any matter that I have personal knowledge of, but I can't do other people's words. I can't be anyone else. So that's just one of those things that's peculiarly me.
Well, we'll have to make your book into a production then, because I would love to see you on stage acting, and you speak so beautifully.
Oh, that's very kind. I was flubbing a lot of words, but it's okay. It's fine.
Now we all do that. It's funny. It's when you're reading. Oh, it's so easy to just read, without talking. But you try to bring it out into the open. It's all new words that we've never seen before.
I've never read that prologue aloud. You may even want to cut it in the YouTube. I don't even know if we'll keep it, but I've never read it aloud, and my gosh, it's
Visceral.
it's so visceral. In my time as a human rights advocate, in my time with UNICEF, I have been close to conflict zones, and I've been with a lot of survivors of war, and that issue of human shields is just so, yeah, as you said, so visceral. And knowing that they really did that in Poland in 1944 during the uprising, it really gets me right in the heart. So it's lovely to begin with that. And of course, when you read The Ghosts of Paris, you understand where these different scenes fit in and whose perspectives we're getting. But just that knowledge of the things that went on in the war, I think it's a good reminder about why we have to tell these stories and why we have to remember.
Yes, and it's so important to tell them without pulling a punch.
Yeah.
That was a very difficult thing to read for me personally, and then for you to read it out loud. That is a very difficult thing. But if we just cover up all the nasty stuff that has happened in the past, we're never going to learn from it. So
that's right. And that chapter has a kind of, a happy ending, if you will, because the woman had amazing skills and was, we learn more about her later, but she comes by those skills honestly, and she was able to extract herself from that really perilous situation thanks to the photojournalist who happened to be watching and photographing, and who broke from his post to save her. And it's really an example of how ordinary people did extraordinary things during those times.
Are these two, just the two from the prologue, are they based on anyone in particular?
Those two aren't based specifically on like an incident, but those sorts of stories absolutely happened. I mean, you're supposed to, as a war reporter or as a photojournalist, to just be watching. But we know, I mean, how could you watch that? How could he hear her and see that? That impulse to intervene, of course, is very strong. In his case, of course, he does it without a plan, and it's all very in the moment, which gets him into trouble. Where we leave off there, we can see he's in a lot of trouble. But those stories are, very real and have happened during that period and certainly onwards. And you just get, you kind of get the most out of stories really by, I think, focusing on the ordinary people doing extraordinary things, as opposed to the stories that we tend to tell and retell, which is about world leaders, about generals, about, Hitler and Churchill. And, those stories are really important to tell as well. But we know a lot about those. What we don't know about are those really extraordinary kind of personal stories of
And
regular
unappreciated,
folks.
unrecognized and unappreciated, definitely.
That's it. That's it.
That's right up my alley for sure.
I
And then,
know, Genevieve, I really appreciate that about your work, that you are similarly passionate about history and human stories, and those like untold or undertold stories, or there's stories that need a fresh perspective and set of eyes to
yes.
really get closer to the truth, or to reveal things that we haven't considered before. I love that about your work.
Oh,
So
thank you. I
I'm
think
glad to
it's up to us to prove to people that history not only happened and existed and went through all these things, but that it's not boring like so many people. It's not black and white photos. It's there's so much to history, and
yeah.
as historical fiction authors, that's what I think is our responsibility, to make them, to help them remember the history by
Mm.
making it real. So, and you did that
That's it, and
so.
it's not the same as the propaganda short films that they were playing in the cinema, where they had wide wide lens shots of tanks going by in black and white, and someone giving a little voiceover, and that's all carefully, carefully scripted with those voiceovers and using shots that they want us to see. But the reality is so much more messy and chaotic and personal, and people's personal lives, and that's where the story is.
Definitely. And then you hop right into 1947, which is
Mhm.
the main
Yes.
gist of the story. And I love the idea of, the private investigator, and even the word gumshoe. I thought, oh, that's just so perfect. And so, and this is your second in Billie Walker's series, right? Is
Yes.
there a third coming? There
I'm
is.
writing the third as we speak. In fact, I was very privileged to get another two-book deal for this series last month when The Ghost of Paris came out. So there'll be at least four in the series. So I'm writing number three. HarperCollins Canada signed up for three straight away, which was brilliant. So The War Widow came out a couple of years ago now. The Ghost of Paris. I won't give away the title for the next one. It'll probably change anyway, but I'm hard at work on that. And now I know as well that there'll be at least one more after that. And my intention is to set each book in a different year, so that we're getting, Billie Walker and that character, and that little constellation of wonderful characters she has around us. We get to watch them through the political and social changes and cultural changes that each of those years bring post-war. And that's, and how they're affected by the wartime events. Obviously, that shadow of war continues till today, actually. So it's very much still alive for them. Those scars are there, and the changes in their lives, they're still grappling with it.
Mhm.
But each of those years also comes with all these really interesting social changes. And yeah, look forward to writing more Billie.
Yeah, of course. And I've said this before, that I've heard from people that say, oh, there's too much World War II stories out there. And I
Mhm.
beg to differ. There are so many. And now that you're talking about post the
Yeah.
war, there's just so much to dig in there. I want to know, your detective agency, Billie Walker, how do you investigate that? How do you research what it's like to run a detective agency? Because I mean,
Mm.
I see Roger Rabbit and all that kind of stuff going on, whatever her name was, and all the flat foot kind of stuff. And I'd like to learn about this.
I actually have my private investigator credentials.
Ah,
So
Perfect.
you can call me Genevieve if you need something done on the side there, Um, I've always joked that if my books, bomb, like this is book number 14 for me. If it suddenly all goes sideways, you'll see me listed in the phone book and I'll just be working as a PI. Look, I got my PI license and did that training and got those credentials because I wanted to learn what PIs did. I needed to know what they know in so much as it's possible to do so. I never actually intend to work as a PI, but I have been out on cases. So I have tailed people. It is one of the, a large part of the work is to follow people who don't know you're following them. And I can tell you that it goes against all of my personal sense of ethics and instinct to follow someone around. But it's what people do and they had to do. And I think with Billie, it's a really interesting twist as well, because she's a woman investigator in the 40s. That was the time before, it was very hard to get divorced. It was a time when the marital laws were really strict. So you could really only get out of an abusive or disastrous domestic situation if you could get photographic proof of adultery. Like,
Yeah.
if you could prove abandonment or adultery, you could get out of the marriage. No amount of abuse or violence made any difference, legally speaking. And so it was incredibly difficult for people who, like a lot of the clients that Billie sees, to try to find their way going forward if their husband went missing and there was no proof of what happened to them. Have they been abandoned? Has that person sadly died in the war? They don't know, they're just stuck and they can't remarry, they can't, So Billie has this actually quite important job. It's, for the women of Sydney who come knocking, she's pretty important to them, but it does mean she has to follow people around. And having done that, I can tell you it's very creepy. I had one experience, for example, where I was with a private investigator. I had my credentials by then and I was sort of training more to do research. And we had to follow a guy who'd, his wife had hired us to prove adultery. And it was 3 days, Genevieve, of me going, this is horrifying. I'm following him through supermarkets. We're following him driving around. He's going to parks. He's just buying a newspaper and getting a Coca-Cola, And then it happened. And then someone met him at the park and they got in the car and it was all happening. And I couldn't believe, I was like, oh my goodness. And suddenly I didn't feel as guilty and weird about, having followed him around. But it is like a really uncomfortable trade. So for Billie, she's always going like, oh, I hope it's not a divorce case, but it is her bread and butter work. And like I said before, there was value in what she could do for the women of Sydney at the time.
That is so fascinating. That's amazing. I love to hear that. And some people travel for research, but you really travel for research, getting right into that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So now I want to switch over. You
Yes.
are an international best-selling author, but you are also disability advocate. You are diagnosed with CRPS, complex regional pain syndrome, which I do not know about, after a hip injury. But like you've got all these titles, you've got all these awards and everything. How do you do all this? And well, let's start at the beginning. How did you get into that? And tell us a little bit about the goal of it.
Thank you, Genevieve. I've been involved as a human rights activist for over 20 years. So that's something that's been very close to me for a long time. I started with the Royal Institute for Deaf and Blind Children and UNICEF, and I'm still involved with that. I'm a Goodwill ambassador. I've been, into the field and into refugee camps and met with a lot of families and a lot of kids, and in, maternity wards and, all of these, just people with extraordinary circumstances and stories. So that work informs me in so many ways, informs my writing, of course, because it's opening my eyes to the different experiences people have. And it's just giving me a better sense of like what the world is really like. Because it's not just, my experience, it's other people's experiences as well. Then in 2016, I got a hip injury, and that hip injury developed into complex regional pain syndrome. So according to the McGill pain scale, it's supposed to be the most painful condition above amputation and childbirth, if you can believe. So I don't know if it's helpful to rate these things, but that's what they say, and I can confirm it's very painful. It's a condition that's mostly characterized by that pain factor, but also comes with other symptoms, weakness in the limb. It's usually a limb, not always, but the vast majority of the time it's going to be a limb. For me, it's my right leg. So as a result of that, I have to pace, I have to use mobility aids. Weight bearing is a little bit tricky for me. I can do it sometimes, and I try to maintain functioning by weight bearing when I'm able to, but often I can't. So you usually will see me with my walking stick, Wolfie. Wolfie has a spectacular, is Wolfie right here? Wolfie has a spectacular head like a wolf, a fierce looking wolf. And Wolfie was my first like dedicated mobility aid when I decided enough, I'm going to actually just go out and get myself a proper mobility aid that I feel proud to use, that fits me properly, and that can help me get around. Because it is a difficult transition to go like, okay, I'm going to start being seen now using a mobility aid. And so I started an Instagram channel
Which is
called
gorgeous.
Tara and Wolfie.
You
Yeah.
have to go and see it. It's gorgeous. I have never seen a wheelchair look so sexy. Everything on that page is beautiful. So
Thank you. Yeah, same thing when I got Hira, my first wheelchair. Again, I wanted Hira to be like, it's an extension of me. And so I've got Frida Kahlo, the artist, on the wheel hubs, and I get a lot of compliments on that. And I think it helps me in my day-to-day interactions because actually people come up and say, that's a really cool cane, instead of saying things like, say, what happened to you? Aren't you too young for that? Because those are the kind of comments I get. I'm actually at my dad's house, my dad and stepmom, and he's just brought Wolfie over for me.
oh, thanks,
So
Dad.
this is Wolfie. Thank you, Dad. This is Wolfie, and Wolfie, yeah, is an important mobility aid for me because it was that turning point. So hence, if you look up Tara and Wolfie on Instagram or on Facebook, you'll see my disability-focused advocacy, and you'll see Hera, my wheelchair as well. Hera is named for the Greek goddess that had a chariot pulled by peacocks. So, I think it's fun to name these mobility aids and really make it part of our world in a way that we can be proud of. And in fact, July is Disability Pride Month. So it's a perfect time to talk about this and talk about how whoever you are, you have the right to get the support you need, whatever that is. Don't let taboos and stigma get in your way.
Exactly. Wow, that's what a wonderful way to end this because we can talk about July. It's perfect timing. You've given me so much to think about, Taris. Thank you so much for being here today and talking
Oh,
about everything from the books,
pleasure.
the writing, and the adventures. I think that probably I could keep you on here for 24 hours and you still have adventures to tell me because you
I
have
have so many stories, Genevieve. Oh my gosh.
so
But it's just such a pleasure to talk about the ghosts of Paris. And, again, and that's a world where there were a lot of vets returning from overseas with disabilities, including Sam, who's Billy's trusty and handsome assistant. So I think that kind of including those perspectives in the work just makes the work more realistic, but also more interesting because maybe we don't hear those stories often enough.
yeah, that's right. And we need to watch for the people that we don't normally see, the little guy that's underappreciated and
Yeah, and has amazing stories to tell.
yes. Oh, that's exciting. I'm only partway through it and
Mm.
I am reading till the end tonight, so I'll be up all night.
Oh, I love that. Well,
Yeah,
I hope you enjoy the rest of the adventure, Genevieve, and thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for the privilege of chatting today, and yes, I really look forward to chatting with you again, Genevieve, and reading Bluebird. I've
perfect.
got it on my to be read stack. I look
There you
forward
go.
to cracking it open.
Now it just bumps right up to the top now. You have to
I'm
just
going to have to. It's now at the top of the to be read.
well, thank you so much and best of luck with the book and all the success in the world with it. And I'm sure we will speak again.
That'd be beautiful. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care.